Ledger is a writing podcast and is definitely charting my interior fears and inspirations. I'm your host, Austin Wilson. Welcome to today's show, where I am chatting with Michel. He is the author of novels Metallic Realms and The Body Scout. He's also a teacher, and he also runs a great Substack called Countercraft, where he wrote an article called Turning Off the TV in Your Mind, where he discusses what he's calling TV brain writing. It originally came out of him encountering writers who say that they don't read and what their prose looks like. I read it and I was immediately like, oh no, I am failing in this exact way, and got scared. As I mentioned in the interview, that's more of a me problem than a Michel problem, but I loved his article, and it made me think about a lot of things, and honestly, it made me focus on my writing in a new way, and I was happy about that. So we talk about that article, but we talk about a lot of other stuff, but he discusses interiority and the ways in which prose fiction can be stronger than a visual medium. Not to say that visual mediums are weaker, but that each of those art forms has things they do stronger than the other. We get into that. We talk about his books, how he wrote Metallic Realms and The Body Scout, what it was like to edit to 3, really, anthologies of flash fiction. The 2 that you can buy are Tiny Nightmares and Tiny Crimes. We talk about that. I love flash fiction, as you know, so there's a lot of stuff that we get into. It's a super interesting conversation because it really does dive into craft in a way that I love thinking about, and the words on the page are sometimes difficult to come by, but when you're focusing on them, either as a reader or a writer, which is another thing that we get into, it's fun. That's a really big thing for the show. It's fun. So I love this conversation. Check out his Substack. Again, it's called Countercraft. I think you can just go to countercraft.substack.com to check that out. I do have affiliate links for his books in the show notes. If you want to buy those and support Mossheart Books and the show, you can click on those and go to bookshop.org. Check out my stuff, austinrwilson.com. As always, also go to austinrwilson.substack.com. That's definitely the URL. I've been posting a lot more stuff there, flash fiction. I'm really thinking that I might start doing a flash fiction story a week, at least, starting in April, after I finish Kathy Fish's flash fiction extravaganza, which I am having a blast with. Check out her Substack as well, and check out her interview, which is the previous episode. But as for now, here is my talk with Michel. Alrighty, Michel, let's talk about TV brain and writing. I read your piece on your Substack Countercraft about TV brain, and I was titillated. I felt a little accused. I loved it, and I wanted to talk to you about all of those things. So give listeners a little bit of a brief rundown on what TV brain is and what led you to write it, and just kind of the reason that the essay came about.
Well, sure. A TV brain is my term for what I'm calling writing that I see a lot, including in student work, which I want to say, like, maybe up front, that the whole point of being a student is to, like, improve your writing. So I'm not trying to, like, dunk on anyone, right? But I think you also see it in fan fiction spaces and other spaces that basically that's writing that feels like it is. To me, it feels like it is primarily influenced by visual media, as in people are sometimes thinking of a TV scene in their brain and not thinking perhaps as much about what prose or fiction can do better than TV, or what it does worse than TV, right?
Right.
Like an example, maybe like 2 examples of that are related, is one thing that so many of my fellow writing professors talk about all the time, is that a lot of student writing has, like, a really overabundance of facial expressions. There's a lot of, like, I sneered, I winked, I smiled. And sometimes, so that feels like very TV to me. Like, when an actor does a little facial movement, it can be interesting because we like human faces. But on the page, reading a lot of facial contortions is normally just kind of weird. I don't see that much.
Yeah.
But the thing that feels the most TV to me related to, like, those kind of facial feature gestures is you will sometimes get stories where writers give what I would think of as, like, a reaction shot of every character. So, like, someone says something crazy and then it's like, Bob gasped and Sally smiled and, Chloe bit her lip, or whatever it might be. And it's like, what is the character speaking, like, looking around at everyone? On a TV show, it makes sense. You check in on all the sitcom characters. I guess the one other thing I should say here for your listeners is that what I'm calling TV brain is just my reductive, simple way to refer to prose that I think is, like, overly influenced by thinking of visual media which is to say, it's not just TV or a critique of TV.
Sure,
It could
sure.
be coming from film or video games or TikToks or whatever.
Yeah, it's a shorthand. You're using a shorthand. As soon as you said it, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this. and that's where I panicked a little, which I think is more a me problem than anything that you did. But I honestly do think it immediately shifted my brain into being like, okay, yeah. And I really loved your discussion of interiority and the ways in which interiority within prose fiction, or even just prose writing in general, although we are obviously speaking more about fiction here, is the like quote unquote superpower of fiction that's on the page. Interiority is a thing that you cannot easily be offered through these other visual mediums. So I want to talk specifically about that and the way it's relating to the writing you're talking about, which also sprung out of you discussing writers who say they don't read.
Well, yeah, that's like an extreme example of people being overly influenced by visual media, right? For writers who are like, I don't like reading fiction, they're more or less admitting that they're only getting anything from getting the influence from visual media. But you asked about, interiority.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I like to think as a writer that, actually, I like to think of as an artist in any medium, right? That it's good to think about your opportunities and lack of opportunities, or your advantages and disadvantages of whatever medium you're working in,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I had like some people read the article who thought I was saying TV and film are bad, or you shouldn't be ever influenced by them, which is absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you might want to think about what the advantages of your medium are. I think that, TV and film, because they have actors, makes a lot of what things like facial gestures a lot more interesting than they are on the page.
Right.
But by the flip side, I do think that interiority is something that is harder to achieve in other medium than it is in fiction. And a really rich interiority in literature is something that colors everything, right? Like if you're from the point of view of a character, like a first person story or a close third section of prose, then what that character sees, like the descriptions of the setting, details even, are going to be filtered ideally through their interiority, right? Through their character. And you're going to learn about them as a character by what they think is messy versus cozy, or whatever it might be, right? And that is something that's like hard to pull off in film and TV. I had a couple of film TV people who like got mad at me about saying that, but there are ways to do it in film and TV, but normally the camera is capturing what it's seeing and not switching visually what it captures by which character it's focused on in a moment. Yeah, I think interiority is a rich thing that writers should lean into normally. There's always exceptions.
Oh, of course. And you touched on it a little bit in both the essay that you wrote and some of the responses that I saw in comments, but also just other posts on your Substack. And it's a giant ball of worms we don't have to get into it as because it's, essentially the internet in and of itself. But that weird, well, what about this? And what about this? Which you talked about calling straw knighting, which I thought was an amazing term for the thing that we all see, which is like you're talking about this very specific thing and somebody shows up and they're like, well, have you read this? Or what about this? And I obviously I admit at the very beginning I said that there was a little bit of me that felt accused only because I was worried that I was failing at this thing that I shouldn't be failing at because I want to be as good as I can. So let's talk a little bit about the ways in which, maybe not this argument, I guess maybe this specific argument about writing that we are talking about as TV brain writing is not saying what's right or wrong. Or is it?
From my perspective, it is all a question of what the author like intends, right? Yeah. I think if you have like intentionality in your work, and that can come about through randomness and certainly revision and such. I'm a huge fan of the surrealists and stuff who intentionally incorporated randomness and dream imagery into their work, right? Anything can be done with intentionality. Yeah. But what I'm calling TV brain is what I feel like becomes like a default mode of writing. And I give you like a couple examples, but another one that I will say personally I find like the most annoying is that I see all the time, and that really feels to me like clearly not something that is being done so intentionally. Yeah, is that I see a lot of writers write scenes that play out in what I would consider real time without like summary. So everything a character says is quoted, even if what they say is really boring. And in prose, it's very easy to be like Bob and Jill had a bit of small talk, and then Bob said, "I want a divorce," right? Like you don't have to add all the small talk if it's not interesting. But when I have students and I'm like maybe workshopping their work, they will often be like, "Oh yeah, I just kind of like didn't think about it. I thought I had to like include everything."
Yeah.
So I think I've already kind of like rambled off topic of
Well,
the question.
no, I think that's pertinent because especially for things that I've been thinking of based on what you wrote, and also I've been writing and reading a lot of flash fiction where you are paring down everything to the essential. And one of the like truisms or like one of the aphorisms you hear people talk about is start as late as possible. It's one that I really, really believe in. Start the story as late as you can where it still makes sense. And all that stuff does go away if you're being really, really, quote unquote brutal, if we want to put it that way, with your prose. You are like, well, he doesn't have to tell her good morning. Like you don't have to hear them talk about what they ate and all of those things. And I think interiority pairs up with that really well because you can indicate those things without having to have them specify them through dialogue, especially if it's boring stuff like, hey. Like,
Yeah. And it makes total sense why a TV scene might have characters like say hey in the beginning. Like,
yeah,
you can't really like have the camera summarize a small talk conversation, but you can do that in prose.
right. Oh, yeah, it's very, very easy. Is this the TV brain writing essay that you've written and thinking about? Is this really just a discussion about escapism versus intellectual engagement? Or is that a false dichotomy?
I think it's a false dichotomy. I mean, I may be like a kind of snobby literary sci-fi whatever guy who likes really dense prose and stuff, but I don't think what I'm saying is in any way restricted to I don't know, highbrow literature or
Mm,
whatever you want to say it. I think really good. I think it's probably true that a lot of commercial fiction is a little more action oriented.
mm,
But I think even if you're reading a good work of commercial fiction, even like very action oriented commercial fiction, there's still often a lot of interiority, and they're cutting out the boring stuff, right? They're making it exciting. And I don't know, the last I mean this I think this author is great, but the last kind of really action kind of thriller book I read was a Jean le Carre book,
mm.
and his books are totally filtered through the characters' interiority, and they're thinking about things. And yeah, I don't think that they're in conflict at all, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think if you're reading like really exciting, even very action oriented science fiction fantasy thrillers or whatever, the good authors are still including interiority and character. And I guess the last thing I would say here is that on this rant is just that interiority and summary and some of these other parts of fiction do not have to be longer
Right.
than like an action scene, right? It can be just a little sentence here or there that does a ton of work.
Yeah, brevity, I think, really benefits in both cases. I mean, you can have brevity in action or interiority, and the thing you said earlier is if it works and if someone's doing it with intention. And as I read your essay and I was engaging with it and thinking about my own writing, but thinking about writing that I've enjoyed in the past, I started thinking about Elmore Leonard and how Leonard's writing had an aspect of what felt really visual to me, but it also felt really, really driven by character. And I was curious if Leonard's writing, I guess maybe in a sort of like straw knighting display, if Leonard's writing is something that you think either does visual writing well, or if he's not engaging in the kind of writing that relies on visuals at the expense of character or interiority.
Well, I've read a little Leonard and think he's great, but have not read enough to like really kind of call
Yeah.
him to mind.
Yeah.
But I would also say like if we're going back to the beginning of what I don't know my main argument is, which is you
Mm.
should lean into the strengths of your medium, right?
Yeah.
And again, I am such a like I think anything can be done well that it I feel like kind of wishy-washy sometimes saying this, but I would say for me at least as a reader, as a general rule, I wouldn't say that prose shouldn't be visual at all. I certainly wouldn't say that. And I also don't think it's bad at being visual, but I think it maybe is visual in a different way. That sounds very vague, so let me be more specific. I was rereading some Raymond Chandler recently, who is first very voicey and has a lot of interiority, but he definitely gives you visual details. But one thing that he normally does is give you maybe just like a couple visual details that summarize a character, right? So there's a big guy who's built like a refrigerator, and then he'll give some, Raymond Chandler metaphor that's like, he looked like a tarantula on a slice of angel food cake in the grocery store, or he stood out like one, I think is that line.
Yeah.
But so that's, first of all, that is visual. Like, it's a great visual metaphor, right? And then saying something like he was wearing he's a big guy built like a refrigerator, wearing a brown suit and had a black eye or something.
Yeah.
I'm not coming up with a great description on hand, but those are like a handful of details that can characterize that character, and the reader can kind of like see them.
Yeah.
On the flip side, sometimes in what I am calling TV brain writing, you'll see this overabundance of visual details where we get like, we're talking about brevity. We get like the opposite of brevity, where we get every single clothing item a character is wearing, and exactly what their height and weight and hair color are and stuff. And you maybe don't need all that. Like, as a reader, I'm just kind of like, I'm not going to memorize every single item of clothing.
Yeah.
Now, there's always exceptions rules. There are times when that makes total sense, depending on the work. And I think in my piece, I gave the example of American Psycho, where, Patrick Bateman as a character is completely obsessed with the shallow surface status level stuff. So it makes total sense that when he sees a character, all he thinks about is, what is the name brand of the suit they're wearing? And,
right.
is it the right style of tie? But it makes character sense. It's not just because the writer is like, I have to describe every detail.
It's funny because that, and Patrick Bateman specifically, and American Psycho sort of connects with this idea that I was messing around with, pop culture sort of inundating every aspect of our lives and becoming the like standard way that we interact with everything. And I was thinking about it sort of literally with TV brain, and if some of us are writing and trying to do the casting director's work for when our fiction gets optioned. And I got a little depressed thinking about that, and then I was like, well, that's a crazy, like, extreme. But then I was also like, well, looking at Book Talk and Bookstagram and all of the places that pop culture has become this like ever-growing engine, I did start to worry if potentially we have internalized this idea that we have to make the fiction that we're writing mirror the reality everyone else knows, which is filled with celebrities, and be like, he's wearing Tom Ford, or he's got a Prada jacket on, and he looks like this person I'll describe, and is Chris Pine. Like, am I crazy?
I mean, that's an interesting thought. That may be very well how people are thinking. I don't think of myself as very celebrity focused. Like, when I'm writing stories, at least,
yeah,
I'm not thinking about what celebrities might play characters. Actually, I'm really not thinking about what they look like so much at all. Maybe that'll sound weird to some of my readers, maybe or to other authors who are like, oh, I have like a clear picture of all my characters. For me, it normally is like a looser thing. I'm like, this person is, roughly that age. That person is roughly this height. But even that only comes up if it matters and if it seems like interesting to point out. But I think there's something to that. I think there's probably a lot of factors here, and some of them might not have anything to do with what I was calling, or like the visual media influence. Like, a lot of people asked if some of this is coming from the over reliance on the adage "show don't tell."
Yeah.
Which may be part of the thing. And then I also think that and I said this in the piece, but there's sometimes this writing idea and, online writing suggestions, or even in MFA programs, maybe, that specific details are always better. And I'm kind of stealing this from a friend of mine who once complained about it, but I remember her talking about how one of her big complaints in modern fiction is that every character seems to go into a room and know what type of wood is in the room. They'll be like, oh, it was a chestnut drawer, and there was like a maple chair, and she's like, I don't know anything about it. I don't ever think about that. I feel that way. I have no idea what is granite and what is marble, or at least I'm not like, maybe I know what marble is, but you get what I mean. I definitely don't know what type of wood furniture is made of. And I'm certainly not walking into my friend's apartment and going, oh, chestnut, maple, black oak or whatever.
Right.
I don't even think that's a tree, but you get what I mean, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, that hyper specificity. I remember reading like maybe the first chapter of The Pale King, which is David Foster Wallace's last book. I never finished it, but the first chapter, it's literally just like a list of flowers. It's like 50 different kinds of plants and flowers. And I was like, I don't know, Dave, if I'm connecting here with what the goal is. And I think that could potentially be what you're talking about, that someone is trying to create an emotion or a feel, and they think that someone being like, the oak paneling was deeply brown and taking us in a direction they don't need to take us in order to make that setting seem real.
Right. There's that, and then I also think it's always going to be for me more interesting if it ties into the character and is in the themes. If the premise there is that this character is just kind of, so bored with their job that they're spending all their time thinking about flowers and they wish they were a gardener, then that makes, character sense.
Sure.
Or same with the wood thing, right? If someone is, there might be a reason that is relevant to the plot and the themes and the character. But if it's just purely there because the writer is like, well, I want to sound like I'm really specific, or I'm like in my mind decorating a TV set, it's probably not coming across to the reader, right? We're probably just like, okay, oak, cedar, whatever.
Neat.
What does that matter?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so sort of related to a lot of this stuff, and we touched on it a little bit already. And because I know you teach as well as write, and you write countercraft as well, I'm so curious about the ways in which people maybe want to tell us that we're thinking about things too hardly or thinking about things too much. And I'm curious if it's a thing that you experience from your students or from faculty or from people within academia, or if it's a very online thing. If someone reacts in a way and at the core of it is you're thinking about it too much. Is that a purely online thing, or have you encountered it in academia?
I mean, I don't know. I'm so far in the opposite direction. I feel like we should all be thinking about things more, right? Like,
Right.
I wish that and I say this for myself too. Like, I wish I was not wasting my time, on Twitter, mindlessly scrolling, and was instead thinking about not just writing, but the big important questions,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, I just get so worried that, and maybe this is a little like doomsaying, but like anti-intellectualism has hit this point in the country where someone just being like, well, let's talk about why the writing works, and someone else just being like, well, I like it, who cares? I get really worried about that, and I'm curious if you think of ways, or if even your essay was a way to be like, no, it's fun to think about these things.
I do think it's fun to think about. Yeah. I mean, I love fiction. I know that there's like this is also maybe an online thing, right? But there's that kind of reflexive, like the despair of being a writer where you have to go online and be like, oh, the worst thing in the world is the blank page. And I can't believe I torture myself every day writing about dragons and stuff. And I was like, no, that's probably pretty fun. Like, I think it's pretty fun to write about dragons. I mean, of course, I have my frustrations and,
Sure.
with writing, but I write because I like it. It's enjoyable. I would rather be doing that than almost any job I have ever worked, right? That stuff was a lot more boring to me than thinking about POV.
Well, it's weird. Is it like, are people being too literal? Like, because I've complained before, been like, oh my God, why am I doing this? This is stupid. But it's not because I dislike it or because I'm wounding myself, or maybe not consciously being like, woe is me, the writer. Let me sip my coffee now. But potentially that's part of it. I mean, the days that I struggle, or in the past when I've talked about how hard it is, have always been about me, because that's the only person I know how to write as. But I'm curious if online has made us all literalists, where we're like, well, why do it then?
Well, it's an interesting question. I feel like this is kind of not really a direct answer, but what you're talking about also makes me think about that maybe there is like a very legitimate distinction between being I hate the word consumer, but
Yeah.
someone who enjoys different medium, whatever, music, writing, movies, and being a practitioner of it. And when I listen to like music, I don't really know how to play guitar or anything. So when I listen to music, I'm like pretty much just listening to the music. And when someone who knows how to play guitar is listening, they're probably like, oh, that's like an A chord going into like, this whatever move.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a relation there in the way a lot of online people, the online discourse would be like, oh, who cares? It's just something fun. Turn off your brain and like pay attention to it. But when you are a practitioner, you can't really turn off your brain. And part of the fun is dissecting things. Like it's interesting as a writer to look at the syntax and grammar of a writer you enjoy, or
Right.
the visual metaphors of Raymond Chandler. And if someone who's a film director, I'm sure, is watching movies and they're enjoying them, but they're also like, oh wow, how did they do that effect? Like, what was that?
Right.
That cut is very interesting, and it's both interesting and enjoyable, and also kind of generative, right? Like that's part of why you do need to read to write, because you
Right.
get ideas from it. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, I can try to pull off that move.
My friend and I, his name's David. He letters comics for a living. And when we both first started out, like I was writing comics, he started lettering. He's lettered every comic I've ever done. We both remembered hitting a point where we were like, oh shit, we can't read comics like we used to. That it wasn't a choice, or necessarily it felt like a loss. I think that's probably an oversimplification, but there was a new thing in our head, because now I'll be like, dude, did you see this comic? And he'll be like, I can't read that. And I'll be like, why? And he's like, look at the lettering. And I'm not a letterer. So I'm like, what about it? And he'll point these things out, and I don't see them until he points them out. Generally, there's some, pretty egregious design choices that I will see, but is it possible to turn that off ever for you? I know for me, some books, generally what ends up happening is if I feel like the prose is clunky, or they're maybe failing in ways that I have seen before and know that I dislike, those things stick out pretty quickly. But typically, I don't feel my writer brain click on until those things happen. Is that similar for you, or is it different?
No, I think that sounds right. I think it's also like sometimes people act like someone who is like an artist, and I'm not using that in a highfalutin way, just like
Yeah.
is practicing an artistic medium, that there's like something inherently, I don't know, snobby or something about how they view things. But I think it's more that just if you are like if you're immersed in that world, you start to recognize cliches and, lazy moves or whatever in a way that someone else doesn't. And yeah, part of that might be that you start to get your own preferences for the type of lettering.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, it's like if I'm reading and things are going smoothly, I'm still thinking about the work, but it's when I hit something like a really clunky metaphor that I'm like, ugh, it takes me out of it, of the work. But
Yeah.
I don't know. There's no way around that. But I guess I think, or for me, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Like I can't turn off my brain and be like, I don't know. How do you even turn off your brain reading? Like your brain has to work to decipher the stuff.
See, what's weird for me is, and I harp on this all the time. My friends make fun of me because I'm so, like, I love narrative, and I don't want to be reminded that I'm an exterior force engaging with, like, I want to be in it. And it's possible for me to forget that I'm like reading in a way, because obviously I can't completely forget I'm reading. I would blink and then be like, holy shit, and like drop the book. Like, I can't forget it. But most of it ends up connecting with metafiction. I hate the break of that fourth wall where, like, don't tell me I'm reading a novel. Like, I know I'm reading a
Mm.
novel. But realistically, like, that function of me immersing in the story to the point where I can just kind of go quickly with it and not have to work, for me, that's when I feel like everything is firing. And in those moments, I truly am not thinking about form or the craft. And I think I get to that stuff, if it's flowing, I get to that stuff later. But that's me. And I think potentially it might be different for everyone, or at least, gradations. But I don't know.
I would imagine it's different for everyone, just that we all have our like aesthetic preferences, right, and things we care
Yeah.
about. But when you're reading in that kind of flow state, which I think I get to as well,
Yeah.
but I would imagine that what interrupts that flow state is when you hit something that feels like really cliche or really lazy choice. So that there's still that aspect of your brain, right, that makes it hard for us to read in the exact same way as someone who is not a practitioner.
Right. So you have two novels. You've also edited two collections of really short fiction. And I would love to talk about the difference between how you worked on all of those things. The big first thing I was thinking about is, and not just because of the TV Brain essay, but I've read The Body Scout, and I was curious about the ways in which you begin a story. And it's one of the things I talk about a lot on the show, is how we begin, not where the idea comes from. Nobody knows. But like, you're very, very, the inflection point of a story. And does it begin with prose on the page, chapter 1? And are you setting out with like an intention of subverting form, or subverting fiction expectations from the reader? Or are you just like, here's my story, this is the thing that I want to do as good as I can, I want to tell the story as well as possible?
My impression is that reader or writers are maybe all driven somewhat by different aspects of the craft, right?
Yeah.
And for me, I might be more driven by ideas and themes, primarily. Like that's kind of what I'm thinking about before I set out. And I think other writers might, or I know other writers are more character driven, let's say,
Yeah.
right? Or more plot driven, story driven. And I'm not prioritizing any of those, just saying that how mine works. Maybe relevant to this discussion, since you asked me about The Body Scout, I do, and then you asked me about the opening of it. That was a novel in which the opening was something I rewrote many times.
Yeah.
And like was probably written more than by rewrite, I should specify, I mean like I scrapped chapters and started in different places. Like chapter 1 became very different chapter.
Yeah.
And relevant to our earlier discussion, the final chapter that I ended up with was written to start in the interiority. Like I think I initially started in more of like an action scene, and then I thought, no, I need to ground the reader a bit in the themes of this book, and then also the like character in terms of like their wants and interiority. And so it starts in terms of the first couple paragraphs with just the character thinking.
Yeah.
And that came about late in the revision process.
Do you think it's a cyberpunk novel?
Yeah, my kind of like gist of that novel in my brain was to write a cyberpunk novel that was not about the internet or virtual reality. Not because I think that virtual reality novels are bad, but just it seemed like that had been done to death. And I was like, okay, what's like a cyberpunk type novel? Or how could I write a cyberpunk novel that was more about body modification, genetic editing? You know, I was reading up a lot on CRISPR, Case 9, and, you know, pharmaceutical drugs. And just it seemed like there was a lot of biotech stuff happening. Of course, now, several years later, everyone's talking about LLMs and AI. So, you know, you never can predict what will happen, I guess.
Moves at a speed that we cannot understand. I've loved it because of the cross section of cyberpunk and sports, where I was like, holy shit, I haven't encountered those two. And I love sports stories because of the human aspect of them. So that crossroads was really, really enticing for me, because those things I hadn't seen paired up in a way where I was like, oh yeah, this is a super interesting concept. So it was neat.
Well, thank you. I would say that, I think there's not as many like sci-fi sports novels as there should be.
Oh, there should be so many.
To your question of like how, you know, these things happen in my mind, that was definitely, it came out of like the thematic questions. Like I wanted to think about the body and the future of the body and reflect that in different ways. And sports seemed like the natural setting for that, since as someone who's like a millennial and grew up in the 90s, like the focus on, you know, the MLB steroid scandals and stuff was heavy in my mind. And I was like, okay, so like a futuristic baseball setting makes a lot of sense for looking at like the forefront of body modification and questions of like, where does the human end and what, and all of those kind of things.
Very different from your follow-up novel. Talk to me about the transition between those two, because not only narration, sci-fi, yes, still sci-fi. I would love to know the kind of the journey you went on through finishing one and then transitioning to the next. And because I haven't read the second one, but I know the narration is different than the Body Scout. So talk to me a little bit about those differences.
Sure. Well, you asked before, like what I'm doing when I like sit down to write and whether I'm trying to subvert reader expectations. And I guess I would like to do that to some degree. But really what I'm trying to do is maybe write something that I find interesting and that will interest me to get to the end of, right?
Yeah.
And part of that, and I'm not recommending this to people because it's probably not the smart way to do things, but part of that for me is I always like want to do something different.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, okay, with the Body Scout, for the Body Scout, I'd written a novel that did not sell, that had a different kind of plot and theme and genre even. And with the Body Scout, I was like, okay, I'm going to try to write something that is unique and interesting, but is more plot driven. And so I'm gonna change up the structure from the abandoned novel and have a first person narrator going on a kind of noir plot quest. And then with the next novel, with Metallic Realms, I was kind of like, well, what can I do that's very different than that? What's like a different idea? And I decided to write this book that was half set in the real world, right? It's about this, I guess for your listeners, it's about a collective of science fiction writers, but in the real world, in like New York in 2010s. And they're writing these collaborative stories that are just kind of fun for them. But the whole novel is narrated by this kind of loser, hanger-on character who considers himself the scholar of their work. And so the structure of the book, it became like very structure driven for me, is this faux academic text. Then I hope that doesn't scare any readers. It's not very academic, but it's like this geeky nerd calling himself a scholar who we include their short stories. So there's the kind of sci-fi aspect. They're kind of like Star Trek pastiches. And then he analyzes the stories, but his analysis chapters spiral out into telling his backstory and the story of this writing collective.
Yeah.
And that's one part of it. If you want me to talk about really practically how I wrote it, I will tell you that because I do have like a real answer here, which is that I was at a writing residency and I was writing some kind of literary short stories. And then also I was finishing the Body Scout. And I was like, I'm going to take a break from this stuff and just write a gonzo space opera tale, just like a totally wacko kind of satire of like, but a loving satire of space adventure fiction, like a, Flash Gordon kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wrote the story and I just thought it was really fun. I just had a good time with it. And then I ended up sending it to a sci-fi magazine, Terraform, which was Vice's sci-fi magazine back in the day. I think it's closed down now. And the editor, Brian Merchant, very nicely published it. And I was like, okay, this is really fun. I got a story published in a very different style than I normally write. Even when I normally write sci-fi, it's not like far future space adventure. And I was writing more of those stories and I was just like, these are really fun to write, but they don't feel like they're weighty enough to like be a book. Like, I don't think anyone's going to read a collection of just gonzo space opera tales that are like not really connected and kind of satirical. So that was one thing that I had. And then I'd always had this idea to write a novel in the form of an anthology of short stories from a writing collective where like the members all end up hating each other and all falls apart. It was just like an idea I had that I'd never worked into anything.
Yeah.
And then at some point I was like, oh, I can combine these two things, right? I can make, because initially the writing group's novel was going to be a realist writing collection, like autofiction stories. So that was how they connected to each other, and you would like see the characters fall apart. But I decided to connect those two things, and then the novel kind of spilled out from there. So it wasn't really like super planned, like I need to do this kind of novel or not, but it was just kind of like that interested me, and it made sense, and it gave me the impetus to actually finish something.
Yeah, that's super interesting, combining the two things. But also you said something about writing a novel that didn't sell. And I'm curious about your relationship with that novel still, like to this day, if that's a thing where you're like, it's bad, or the market wasn't ready, or I need to fix some things. I'm curious about your relationship to it and the ways in which maybe it relates to Metallic Realms and the Body Scout, and if there are pieces of it in either books or how it relates to all of those things.
Well, I would say, like most writers, I have also like a plethora of like half-started novels that were abandoned and stuff. The novel that I sent out, the first one, was, I think, both probably not that good, and the market was like wrong. By that I mean, but this will make sense if I say it, which is that it was a novel about superheroes. So it was there in the same way that Metallic Realms has kind of a loving pastiche send up of space adventure fiction. This book was kind of like that for Silver Age superhero comics. It was kind of like I was combining, for me, the kind of cleverness or the joy of it was that I was taking a very action oriented genre of superhero work, but the book was like really heavy on interiority, and it was like the characters were almost going on these Thomas Bernhardian rants. And if any listeners are interested, I did publish the first chapter in a magazine called American Short Fiction, and the story is called "The Supervillain Stalled in His Lair." So you can find it online, I think. And it was about this supervillain in a kind of, massive underground compound, like the type that, well, Batman's not really supervillain, but the type that Batman or Doctor Doom or whatever has, and just like ranting about the superhero and how people don't understand him and things like that.
Yeah.
The reason I say that like maybe the market was not correct is whatever that means, is that I got a lot of rejections that were basically like, I don't think people are that interested in like superhero stuff. And then like a couple years later, the MCU is like the biggest game in town, right?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
I mean, maybe they were right. Maybe the novel wouldn't have sold, but there was this sense that like, oh, superheroes, no one really cares about that.
Well, I mean, potentially, who knows? I mean, I've read what was the Austin Grossman novel? It was about supervillains, and
yeah, I didn't read that because it was like too similar to mine. But it's called "Soon We Will Be Invincible." Is that right?
one. Yes, soon we'll be invincible. I liked that, but also, I mean, Peter Klein's the X Heroes series. I don't know. I think you probably could still publish that novel, and people would be into it. So then, sort of pretty different than those two things, the collections, the tiny collections, Tiny Crimes and Tiny Terrors. I have that one.
Tiny Nightmares.
Talk to me about those and the ways in which you worked on those. And also, you said a thing about publishing these stories that didn't feel weighty enough for a novel and weren't connected. And I was like, that kind of sounds like he's describing the tiny books with these tiny stories. And I'm curious the ways in which anthologies maybe scratch a different itch, but also kind of just how you operated as an editor on those books, because I think my listeners will be really interested to know what that role actually means in the case of like two anthologies of short fiction.
Sure. So I have a pretty clear answer to that, which is, well, first I should say that both of those anthologies were co-edited with Naji Nieto.
Yeah.
And the genesis of this is that when I was in grad school, I met some friends and we were all like interested in flash fiction. And at the time, flash fiction was not that common. Nowadays, I feel like you see flash fiction everywhere. You know, the New Yorker will publish it, Paris Review will publish it. But at the time, which feels like not that long ago, but now that I'm saying it was like almost 20 years ago, it felt, you know, there weren't that many venues that like focused on flash fiction. And so we, me and a couple friends, a couple writers, James Ye, Annie DeWitt, and Rosalia Jovanovic, we created a magazine together that we called, somewhat ironically, Gigantic. And we only published flash fiction. And we did a bunch of issues that were really fun. We were certainly inspired by magazines like McSweeney's that do like a different thing each issue. Yada yada. So that's the backstory.
Yeah.
And then at some point, I was getting tired of doing the magazine just because it was a lot of work, and I wanted to try doing like an anthology. And flash fiction seemed like an easy way in because that was already what I was editing.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, as is probably obvious to given my discussion of cyberpunk and space adventure fiction and superhero comics, I really enjoy genre fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, and horror especially. And we decided, the other thing to say here is I always think that there's a bit of a false divide between like literary fiction and the genre world, right? They exist in kind of different ecosystems, but quality wise, you know, there's a lot of kind of false barriers put up.
Yeah.
So our inspiration was to combine literary, quote unquote, literary fiction authors with quote unquote genre authors in the same anthology with flash fiction. And the first one we actually published was self-published, and it was called Gigantic Worlds, and it was all sci-fi stories. Yeah, it was good. We had like a Kickstarter that ended up making enough money to print it, and we did this very fancy printing, and that was also co-edited with Nigel Nieto. And from that book, because it was like the only book we ever published, we couldn't get like great distribution for it, but we sold it through the Kickstarter. And then we were like, okay, if we do another one, let's sell it to a publisher.
Yeah.
And so we were like, okay, we already did a science fiction one. What's the next one to do? And we did Tiny Crimes, which was kind of a noir mystery type detective stories. And again, it combined like writers from the quote unquote genre world, the quote unquote literary world. And then Tiny Nightmares is the same idea with horror fiction.
I love Tiny Nightmares. It's one that I go back to quite a bit to get inspiration and also to kind of refill my tank when I need flash fiction. I adore flash fiction. It's a big part of my life, and I'm actually writing 22 stories a day, like one a day, up until March 22nd with Kathy Fish, who I interviewed previously on the show.
Oh, nice.
Do you write flash fiction?
I do, but I find myself increasingly drawn towards longer term fiction, but I'm like trying to stuff flash fiction in too, in a way. Like that sounds vague, but I'll give you a more specific thing, which is that my next novel, which I sold on a partial, so I haven't finished it.
Yeah.
But it's about a haunted house neighborhood. Like they import haunted houses from around the country, and there's a whole lot more plot to it, but because of that format, I'm like sticking in little flash fiction horror stories about each house as kind of like background.
It almost sounds like Metallic Realms too, like these sort of like portmanteau stories where there's like stories.
Yeah, it is like that, but they're a bit more specifically flash fiction, whereas I guess a couple of the Metallic Realms ones were flash fiction. Yeah.
Well, that's super interesting. I wonder why your head's doing that. Do you know?
I don't know, but I do think probably that I'm someone who really loves short fiction in general, and I think the short stories are maybe my favorite form, but it's hard to sell short story collections, so I'm like, how can I write a novel that's also a short story collection?
That's a smart way to think about it. And also, for me at least, I know how my brain and body works, and the marathon of trying to finish a thing that's like, all right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write 115,000 words. That marathon is really hard for me because of mental health and things that I deal with. And the feeling of a flash piece or of a short comic or writing something helps me kind of chain together all of these creative moments to create a larger thing. And I hope it's not because my attention has been eroded by the stupid internet, or if it's just because of age or just, the way my brain has developed. But I really do think, especially now, like you were talking about, flash fiction is a lot more prevalent than it previously was, even 5-6 years ago. But I think selling a collection of short stories, especially right now, is a little easier if you're like, but they're only 1,000 words.
Yeah, I mean, I feel you in these questions of attention span and stuff, but I also think like to bring it back to like the earlier discussion of leaning into strengths and weaknesses. Like,
Mhm.
I often think about what is the way that we're working on something that like when the compositional method influences the form of the work in a way that is like, I don't know, generative and interesting. There's a book that I really enjoy by a writer named Mary Robeson called Why Did I Ever? A very like realist kind of book about, a person with problems and all that kind of stuff. But Mary Robeson, was working in Hollywood at the time. I can't remember what her role was there, but it doesn't really matter for the story, which
Yeah.
is that she had like a stack of note cards with her. And when she had like a lunch break, she would go into her car and like write down, a short, basically like a tweet length idea or a little scene, very short flash fiction.
Yeah.
And then she just strung those together as a novel. And if you read the novel, it is almost reading like a novel in tweets, although it predates Twitter. But it's like just lots of very short little flash pieces.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I think, and I've talked to other writers about writing on their phones and getting words onto a page wherever they can. I can never feel the thing that I need to feel if I'm writing on my phone, unless I use this program called Obsidian that like I can sync across all my devices and then like link within that for some reason that program specifically helps me. But if I'm like in my notes or if I'm texting myself or emailing myself, it feels too removed from like composition. Like what did you just say? Like the form of composing is sort of generative.
Yeah, like I think it's good if you can make, not that you have to do this, but it can be good if the compositional practice is like mirrored in the form of the piece. Like the Mary Robeson example, I think it probably would have been very, very hard to take those flash note card pieces and then string it into like a traditional narrative. So instead, she just strung them together as they are. Or to give another example of someone who always influences me is Italo Calvino used to say that he just like kept note cards of ideas. And one of those was like ideas of different types of cities. And then that just became Invisible City. You see the form mirrored there, right? For those who haven't read Invisible Cities, it's largely 55, more or less flash fiction descriptions of invented cities.
Super cool. Yeah, I
Yeah.
recommend to everyone grab it if you can get a copy of it. Also, I was gonna is Gigantic Worlds in print, or do you have copies of that available anywhere? Or because that sounds like a perfect companion to the other ones that I have.
I have some myself, but I don't like actively sell it because, well, I don't know, Gigantic, the magazine ended and stuff.
Yeah,
We're just like not
yeah,
together. There's a thing that's like very hard to sell a book as an indie publisher, which is basically where it was basically self-publisher, and
yeah.
we called ourselves Gigantic Books, but didn't have like offices or anything, right? And the thing that maybe you don't realize until you do that is that you really have to have distribution
Yep.
to get into bookstores, and most distributors understandably don't want to take on a press that only has like one book. Like
Right.
it's just not really worth it for them. So
Yeah.
we sold it at the time, but now I just have some copies in my closet.
Kind of a bigger, sort of maybe impossible to answer question. A lot of people talking up right now, you'll see articles about it and people, online about how much reading is in danger and how few people are reading. And I just would love your thoughts on that. And as a teacher, I'm also curious. I try to avoid talking about LLMs however much that I can, but I'm just so curious about the ways in which those things have affected your world as a teacher and a writer and a reader. And if you see, tell me about the hopeful path forward, I guess is the core of the question.
Well, yeah, these are big topics, and I certainly have lots of thoughts about them. I find myself somewhat more maybe like optimistic. I don't even know if optimistic is the right term, but like less bothered than some other people in that I kind of grew up as someone who was really, really into like punk music and underground hip hop and surrealism and all these things that were like never that popular in their time, or
Yeah.
even like, very literary fiction or weird science fiction, all these things. So I always came into art, broadly speaking, into writing not expecting to be like a bestseller. And so
Right.
I really can't, I think that there's these huge issues going on for sure, especially with LLMs. But on the one hand, I don't know, I guess I don't know how much it affects like the world that we're in, right? Like, I don't know if people who care about interesting science fiction books, if they're like their numbers are shrinking or growing because a lot of people are like using LLMs to turn in their homework assignments or something.
Right.
As a professor, I sometimes teach undergrad composition and then also MFA graduate school level fiction. In the undergraduate, it's a complete mess. I mean, it's really like it's just so widespread, and I think honestly a lot more widespread than even the panicky articles admit to.
Yeah.
I think it's very dangerous for education for a lot of reasons. I think like I think professors haven't even caught up with the fact that you can now get like meta glasses that'll just scan, even like a Scantron quiz and give you the answers, yada yada. So that's
Yeah.
a big topic. But in my graduate fiction classes, when I do teach those, I actually don't find many of my students very interested in using LLMs at all.
Yeah.
It seems like if you're interested in making fiction, making art, for the most part, obviously there's exceptions, but most people like that's what you want to do. It's like
Right.
I did an interview with a writer named Helen Phillips and asked her about this because she had a book that had like artificial intelligence characters. It was kind of about that. And I think if I remember her quote correctly, she was like, writing fiction is my favorite thing I get to do with my brain. Like I would never want to give that to anyone else, much less a computer program.
Yeah. Yeah. Offloading even the worst days. Like why would I do that? Like why it just would take away. I was talking about this recently with some other writers at a writers group that I run about how we have already sort of been trained, or they're like training us to assume that hard work should always be figured out. Like we should always figure out how to get around hard work. And it's a weird new, like this wave of of this, like the opposite of things that people have been telling us for decades and decades and decades. And I mean, there's also the popular meme where it's like, I don't want AI to do my art, I want it to do my dishes. And yeah, I'm interested. I think to hear that MFA level students are pushing it away, or not using it, because I mean, I guess it's not surprising. Like you said, if you are interested in using your brain to create fiction, then you're not going to not do that.
Yeah. Well, it's also like, you know, maybe you feel differently, but I can like really pump out a lot of words. Like if I was sitting down and just like I don't really care about the quality that much, I could like pump out, I don't know, 5,000 words in a day. And but like the good work, or what the work that feels good to me, is when it does take a lot of time, and it's a lot of that is revision, right? You're in there and you're like, oh, you make these connections and you're like, oh, this could be a little interesting if I change it this way and that, which is just to say that like what is even the advantage from like a fiction writer's point of view of outsourcing to an LLM that maybe gives you like, I don't think it even can do this yet in long form, but let's say that it gave you like, your average commercial level fiction quality prose, which
Yeah.
I want to stress here that your average commercial fiction aspiring prose does not sell, right? It's only the rare amount of it that
Right.
actually sells well.
Right.
So yeah, like what is even the point of doing that? Like if I didn't care about my writing that much and I just wanted to pump it out, I would just get some how-to guide to write like a James Patterson type book and just like pump it out really quickly.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Amazon right now is filled with LLM garbage
Yeah.
being published as quickly as possible. And you brought up a good thing there, though, which is commercial, like standard commercial fiction. And I just saw a thing on Substack yesterday, someone sort of shaking their fist at a critic lauding a sentence that they considered to be normal. And I'm trying to figure out how to say it as kindly as possible. A sentence that they thought was normal, and that was the problem. That fiction should be above normal. That it should be accomplishing things past commercial and past serviceable, to the point where they would like diagram the sentence and be like, this is the most normal and boring writing you can have. And I'm curious if, and this is just me spitballing because I don't even know the answer myself, if we have a responsibility as writers and readers to be like, no, normal writing is writing that we need.
um, well, I think I might need to know the context of this to know where I would fall on it. But I do think in general that the process of like singling out small sentences or passages to talk about is like not that helpful.
Yeah.
Like I thought, the New York Times did that AI LLM human quiz, right?
Yeah.
Which do you like? And there's a million things you could say about that, but it really does feel to me like, regardless of the questions of the quality of AI, that you cannot judge. I don't. There's no reason just pulling a random couple sentences from the middle of a scene and trying to
Right.
like analyze it outside of the larger context. And that's true of sentences too. I guess I really like a flashy fireworks sentence, but I also think that those work the best surrounded by more normal
Yeah.
sentences. So it's not like an either or question, I guess.
No, I think that's a really good point, and it kind of ties back in all the way back to the TV brain writing, and a thing that I was curious about, somewhat as a like antagonistic question, not truly, but just like a devil's advocate type thing.
Give it to me. I'll take it.
Is it a fool's game to compare all writing using the same like methods, or should we ever allow for like what we would call bad writing if it exists in a form that isn't really either consciously or subconsciously intentionally trying to, like, let's say commercial, I don't want to say a genre because I don't want to piss people off, commercial fiction that sells well and usually is at the top of the lists. Is it fair to judge that writing using the same metrics as we would judge something where somebody's like, okay, I don't care if this sells, and I want to do something above quote unquote commercial or normal?
Yeah, no, I think we need a range of things, and we can judge all those things differently. I also think that there can be like good commercial fiction and bad commercial fiction, right? Like that it's not like selling well means that your work is bad from my point of view,
Right.
or the flip side from your average consumer's point of view, I guess. But I don't know. I think most good commercial fiction, and probably even most popular commercial fiction, is like somewhat intentional in what it's doing, right? And it's not defaulting to some of those things I was criticizing
Yeah.
in the TV Brain article. But I'm 100% come from the point of view of like anything can be done well, anything can be done interesting, anything can even be done in a very literary way. In my article, I gave some examples of stories that have no interiority because
Yeah.
they're very consciously doing that, and they're using third person objective point of view. uh, I I love stories that have no plot. I love stories that are very tightly plotted. Anything can be done well, but I also think that's what's great about fiction. It's like such an expansive form that can do anything.
Yes, I agree. Last two questions. First up, I saw someone on Substack, because I read your thing about the punk mindset within publishing, and how right now publishing is, experiencing a lot of upheaval for all kinds of reasons, including some we've already talked about. But the punk mindset, which is a thing that I agreed with, that we now have these we have abilities that we didn't previously, and able to get our work out to people. And I saw someone respond to your post and said, but who doesn't want that, and that's the consumers. They want the work to be as easily accessible as possible, and they don't want to have to struggle to find it. And I was curious about your thoughts on that. Again, when I read your piece, I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do.
Well, this is, it gets back to kind of, I mean, even the idea of, I knew I was going to get some flack for that article because it's like somewhat earnest
Yeah.
and such. But
Oh, yeah.
part of what I was saying is that like, I did grow up like really loving what we call like punk music very broadly, all the kind of genres, underground music that has grown up with, or has built out its own show spaces and magazines and distribution networks, right? And that stuff was never going to be charting the top next to topping the charts. Oh
Topping
my
the
god!
chart.
Yeah, I need more coffee, right? But yeah, it was never going to compete with Taylor Swift or whoever is topping the charts. But it was never trying to.
Right.
And that was, to me, that's part of, it kind of ties into what I was saying before too. But part of how I think about writing, like obviously, I would like to have a lot of readers, and I would love to get a lot of money, and I would love all that, right?
Sure.
But I would love that only if I'm writing the kind of stuff that interests me. I wouldn't want to write very lazy, or to me, what would be lazy and uninteresting books just because it would sell more.
Yeah.
Right. So that was part of the mindset in general. And the other thing I was trying to say there is that I think you can create these kind of like what we might just call scenes, right? And within those scenes, the consumers, so to speak, do want that music. They're in that scene. And I do feel like we have lost, there's a lot that comes out of like communities, if you want to sound a little more high-minded, or just scenes, or like regional artistic groups and stuff, that has been lost, I think, a bit in this internet age, in which hypothetically that stuff could even be super powered, but in reality we're in this kind of algorithmic driven culture where we're all competing for the same clicks and the same views on the same platform. So it's, you're always going to be getting more popularity if you're like following the trends in the memes, right? Because that's just like how those algorithms work, right? You do the TikTok dance because that's what is going to get you views. You could do that, but it's not as interesting to me.
Yeah, I know. And I think even if you don't think about those like smaller communities, or if you're not focused on it, like just the idea of being like, okay, well, I have this story and I bet I could sell it to 1,000 people or 500 people, and not be like, I'm going to sell this to 50 million people. And to me, when I read that and thought about what it meant to me, because I also am a fan of punk music and some of the things that it stood for and still stands for in some cases. That's what it was, which was like, well, I do like, sure, if somebody was like, I'm going to give you $10 million, I'll give you $1 million, I'll you whatever, change my life, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that I can start by being like, well, I want to sell this to the people that I know for a fact want it and are here in this community. And that might be 500 people. That might be 1,000 people. That's what I got out of your essay, which was, that's the punk ethos and the mindset, is like the community, which I don't even think is super high minded. I think is pretty much a common way to think of it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we might be about the same age. I don't know. But maybe, did you listen to like Fugazi when you were younger?
Oh, yeah.
And like, another thing about that kind of era of like punk related music or independent music is that like a band like Fugazi, who was pretty big for that, but they were not, again, topping the charts or charting the tops or whatever I said earlier. And they could kind of survive on that, right? And that's part of, for me, you know, what has been lost is that part of the algorithmic tech driven culture is that Spotify sucks all the money up, and you can only make any money if you're getting billions of streams. Whereas it used to be, you could kind of, not get rich, but you could like have a career if you were like a fairly well-known independent band selling your own records and stuff. And maybe some of that stuff is coming back with things like Substack and Patreon, where you can actually have a smaller fan base, but if they're willing to give you $5 a month or something, you can start to have some actual income that then can allow you to focus more on the work.
Yeah. One of the big things I like to think about when I'm making something, or I'm going to make something, is how will this thing help me make another thing? Not that I'm not focusing on the actual creation and what I want out of the thing that I'm making, but if it in some way helps me, whether it's through my own inspiration or because, yes, it finds readers, but if that is a thing that I can get out of something, which is another thing that I thought about when I was reading your essay, is like, okay, well, how can I feed back into the thing I'm creating and help myself, like giving me some sustenance, whether literal or figurative, for the next thing. That's always a big aim for me.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. And that's part of why, like, the popularity thing, I don't know, like, if you're really trying to chase popularity by itself, like, first off, why even write fiction?
Right.
Or like, why write at all?
It ain't the year.
And, having something that's very popular, regardless of what it is or the quality, is normally like fairly hollow.
Yeah.
I've written for a lot of websites, and I've had articles that went viral and got like 1 million views, but they were normally my least interesting articles. Like the first one I had that had like 1 million views because it like topped Reddit was just like a list of short books. And I can't pretend that that's because I had some great insight or like made good arguments. It was just because people like to read short books for whatever attention span reasons, and it came up on Google and stuff. So it was, I'm happy it like got readers, but it didn't like feed my soul in the way that selling a short story to a great magazine that only has 500 readers might.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wrapping up, loved the essay on Countercraft Substack that you run. Tell us what's next. You kind of mentioned it already, working on a horror novel. What else can we expect from you?
That's my main thing now. I'm working up on that, but Countercraft, I try to do like something weekly. So working on some things for that. Got the draft folders.
Hell yeah. Lincoln,
Ready.
Michel, I appreciate you coming by.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you coming by. Thank you again to Lincoln Michel for stopping by to chat about his fantastic Substack. I love it. Make sure you go check it out, countercraft.substack.com. And yes, check out the books as well. I just got a copy of Tiny Crimes the other day. I'm going to dive into that one, and it'll probably go right next to Tiny Nightmares on the stack of things that I return to regularly to get inspiration and to just enjoy some short fiction. Make sure you go to my website, austinrwilson.com. Also follow me on Substack at austinrwilson.substack.com. I've been posting the podcast episodes there as well as on wherever you've listened to this today. So another place you can check it out if you want to. But I really think I'm going to be doing more flash fiction there. So keep your eyes open for that. You can follow me on Instagram at mossheartbooks, and our website, mossheartbooks.com, also has stuff that you can check out as well. Like and subscribe and share the show, all those things. I have a lot more interviews coming up this year. I already have another one that I've recorded that I'm going to be editing and releasing in a couple of weeks, and then April is filling up, and I think I've already got into May as far as scheduling, so I have at least four more episodes already planned and in the works, and a couple of books that I have to read, so yeah, there's a lot more stuff for you to listen to in the future. I appreciate it.